Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. Welcome to our roundtable on pathways to shared prosperity in Europe. My name is Michael Castanera. I'm a professor and a researcher in economics at Solvay, the Department of Economics and Management at the Université Libre de Bruxelles. And I'm also the local head of the Global Economic Challenges Network, which was created by my dear colleague Frank Vella of Georgetown University here. The event today is organized jointly with the CEPR in London and benefits from the support of the different science foundations in Belgium, FNRS, EOS, and BELSPO. So we have three amazing panelists here to address a very important topic. For almost 80 years, we have been living in a world that witnessed much fewer wars than before, and where the standards of living have tremendously evolved, not only in Europe or the US or the OECD, but globally. Did you know, for instance, that in 1980, 40% of the global population was living in extreme poverty? That number fell to 16% by 2017. This amazing progress could not have happened without institutions that have been created since World War II. And of these, the European Union is particularly prominent. Despite these achievements, there is an increasing sense of resentment in the population, a growing rejection of global institutions. It is frequently argued that our institutions no longer protect the average person, that they only serve some form of global elite. And so this begs the question, are our institutional arrangements still capable of delivering shared prosperity? To caricature the setup in Europe, the Union, is responsible for the creation of resources, among others through the single market. And national governments instead have the responsibility of taxing and redistributing that prosperity. So the questions we want to address today are, is this setup politically and economically sustainable? How can we sustain shared prosperity? And what is the way forward? What do we want to reform and how? So, as I said, we have three extraordinary panelists with us. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. Margrethe Vestager, you are Executive Vice President of the European Commission. You have been the Commissioner for Competition since 2014. And since 2019, you have been also leading key initiatives of the Commission, such as the Europe Fit for a Digital Age strategy, which culminated into the new Digital Services Act a few days ago. Before that, you were a minister in the Danish government, where you had several portfolios, including education, economic affairs, and the interior. André Sapir, you are honorary professor at the Université Libre de Bruxelles and a senior fellow of the think tank Bruegel. Previously, you were economic advisor to President Romano Prodi and external advisor to President José Manuel Barroso. All this at the European Commission, of course. You also sat on the European Systemic Risk Board, where you oversaw Europe's financial responsibility. And to the broader public, you are known for the Sapir report, which analyzed pathways to reinforce the economic performance of Europe, and for your work on how to reform social models in Europe. Gabriel Zucman, you're a professor at the Paris School of Economics and at the University of California, Berkeley. You are also the founding director of the EU Tax Observatory, and a strong advocate of fighting excessive inequality with your co-authors Thomas Piketty and Emmanuel Saez. A few months ago, you were awarded the John Bates Clark Medal, which in economics we describe as a Nobel Prize for an economist below the age of 40. Congratulations for that. Thank you. You also co-authored the recent Global Tax Evasion Report 2024, which will be a crucial input for the discussion today. So the three of you asked me to be very brief. I just would like to start with three short questions that will require a short answer. My first question would be to you, Ms. Vestager. One of the Commission's main role is to ensure that European economies are sufficiently prosperous. As a Commissioner for Competition, your task has also been to prevent monopolies from keeping that prosperity for themselves. But as we know, the EU represented 26% of world GDP in 1980. In comparison, the US share was only 21% today. No, sorry. In 1980, the US was below the EU by 5%. Our share today is below 15% and below that of the US. So I have a two-pronged question for you. Should we conclude that the single market underperformed? And when you started as a commissioner for competition, what were your first priorities to guarantee fairness, and were these priorities successful?
Well, I think success is to be judged by those who comes later. But I think the most important point here was to say that we started talking about fairness, introducing that, for instance, an efficient market outcome, which is a competition law, economics, legal term, has a real meaning to people. That there are groceries on the shelves at prices that you can afford, that resources are redistributed for those who can use them in the most efficient manner. Sort of combining the advocacy that competition serves people with the casework that we have been doing consistently, and I think also pushing some of the cases to include new theories of harm that businesses can do, for instance, to harm innovation in merger cases, to look at potential competition in the future. So in that respect, I think just to introduce the concept of fairness as something that is absolutely core of competition law enforcement, I think that was really important to restart part of the conversation about what it is that we are up against. The second thing is that the single market is so not done. We are only still working on having a capital market union. It is still much weaker than what you see in the US. We do not have a single market for telcos. They are still in very national markets. We still need to push for a digital single market. Many people still feel that they are being captured by roaming, no, not roaming, by geo blocking for looking at things that they thought they had paid for already, but they are trying to see them in a different part of Europe. So the single market is not done. It is work in progress. And the single market is also not something that you can say that was it, because the single market is a bit like a lawn. You have to maintain it, you have to move it, otherwise trees will be creeping in. And with that, I mean that if you're not really vigilant, there will be barriers. Member states will erase barriers of one sort of another. Businesses will try to make standards that are prone to their national market. So the single market is something that you need to work on every day. What has happened over those 10 years is also that industrial policy has reemerged. Geopolitics have changed. And I think there are very good reasons for Europe to be much more precise on priorities. For instance, what we enable within the temporary crisis and transition framework, with the transition part of it, to make sure that clean tech actually can prevail. What has been done in research and innovation is also an expression of that. My point would be to say, whenever you use public funding here, you need to make sure that you do that on the basis of a competitive market, because otherwise the risk that you will lose the effectiveness of your public spending is enormous. So without competition as a driver in the marketplace, you will not get what you want from your public spending, from the aid that you're devising.
We'll return to that.
And last but not least, we just had the Amazon judgment today, which is the courts hugely limiting what we can do in order to make sure that every company pay their fair share of taxes. Because on your premise that part of the EU responsibility is to create resources, that part of the member state responsibility is to distribute resources, they do that in different ways. They do that by enabling education, social services, but also by their tax systems. And here I'd say we still have quite some way to go, despite what we have done over the last 10 years in order to secure tax justice. Because we're still in a situation where majority of companies, they work very hard to make a profit. From that profit, they pay their taxes. And they are still faced with competitors who do not make the same efforts. And that, of course, also means that despite what we've had, the OECD agreement, new legislation at European level being implemented at national level, we're definitely not done when it comes to fairness in taxation.
You should have been the moderator of this panel because you're doing the perfect transition for my question to Gabriel Zucman. So I read the Global Tax Evasion Report 2024, and I advise everyone to visit the website of the Tax Observatory. There is a wealth of information. It's incredibly rich. And you coordinated a team of how many hundreds different researchers, right?
More than 100.
More than 100 on that topic. So the job is just extraordinary. When I was reading that, I was struck by one thing. There is this one issue that you are emphasizing, and Mr. Steiger emphasized exactly the same thing. We are hearing of a base evasion, I forgot the acronym, BEPS, and you are saying it makes basically no progress. So some exceptions, exemptions have been creeping in from everywhere, and it gives the impression that in the end, we can try what we want as an initiative, and in the end, pays nothing. The tax justice that you mentioned is not showing up. So should we be so pessimist about that? To caricature some articles I read were mentioning the end of capitalism, the end of the capitalism that allows shared prosperity. So do you think this is that dramatic?
I'm not that pessimistic. Look, there has been real progress over the last 10, 15 years on some key issues. 10 years ago, it was really easy for wealthy individuals to hide assets in tax havens because there was a complete bank secrecy in a number of countries. Today, since 2018, there's an automatic exchange of bank information between offshore financial institutions and tax authorities in more than 100 countries. That has led to a significant decline in one specific form of tax evasion, but an important one, which is the concealment of wealth in tax havens. And when progress happens, I think it's important to acknowledge it and to celebrate it. It's rare, but sometimes it does happen. And it's a source of hope because it illustrates something which is very important, which is that tax evasion, tax avoidance, tax competition, financial opacity, these are not laws of nature. Okay, they are policy choices. We can choose to tolerate tax evasion or even sometimes to encourage it, just like we can choose to fight it. So that's what makes me fundamentally optimistic about our collective ability to overcome some of the major challenges that you've mentioned. That being said, almost everything remains to be done. And there are major issues that require immediate attention. Number one is that there's been much less progress in fighting tax evasion by multinational companies. There is more than €1 trillion in profits that are shifted each year to tax havens globally. Almost half of that in EU or European tax havens. And there was high hope in 2021 when 140 countries and territories agreed on a minimum tax of 15% it's an important agreement. It's even, one might say, a landmark in the regulation of globalization, because it's the first time that there is an international agreement that puts a floor to how low certain tax rates can go. And yet it's really insufficient, because the tax rate is low, because there are many exemptions and loopholes in that agreement, and because when we run the numbers, and we developed with the EU Tax Observatory a very sophisticated model to study this complex agreement, the revenues, the extra tax revenues that we can explain from the agreement as it stands and as it's going to be implemented next year in the European Union are very limited. We're talking about an increase in global corporate tax revenues of about 5%, when 2 or 3 years ago, we could expect maybe twice as much or 3 times as much as that. There is an even bigger problem, which is that our tax systems fail to properly tax the very wealthy. So there are now a number of studies, whether it's in the US, in Italy, in France, in the Netherlands, that show very clearly that billionaires have extremely low effective tax rates, much lower than the rest of the population. Why? Because when you're very rich, it's very easy to avoid the individual income tax by structuring your wealth such that this wealth is going to generate very little or sometimes no taxable income. A couple of years ago, there were revelations in the US from the US media ProPublica about the tax payments of the top US billionaires, and you could see that in some years, Jeff Bezos paid zero, Elon Musk zero or almost zero. The top US billionaires
Volunteered.
could he even asked to benefit from a family. He asked for family benefits, which in the US are reserved for the middle class, because he said, look, my taxable income is zero. I'm really poor, so I need a little cash transfer from the government. But the point is that it's not limited to US billionaires. It's something that very much happens in the European Union as well, as far as we can see. And it's a problem for the sustainability of the European Union, of globalization, of the single market. Because look, if international economic integration means ever lower taxes for its main beneficiaries, multinational companies, wealthy individuals, and at the same time higher taxes for the economic actors who don't benefit a lot from it or sometimes suffer from it, low-income workers, retirees, then everybody understands that this is very unlikely to be sustainable.
So, first, thank you, the both of you. I'm going to switch to my third and last question. This begs lots of additional questions. So please do not hesitate, if you're following online, to send your questions in the writing. We will be raising them later, and I will be switching to the audience momentarily. André Sapir, as I mentioned earlier, you identified and you popularized the notion of social models in Europe. And Mr. Staiger will be happy to be reminded that the Nordic model stood out as being quite superior in the sense of being capable of delivering both prosperity and equality. You were already back 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago, already advocating for reforms, lots of reforms. And I think your thought has probably evolved over the last 20 years. Are you still so positive about the Nordic model? What would you recommend today? Or what do you rather to speak still about the past so that we can have questions about the future? What changed in positive or negative ways over the last 20 years?
Great question. So I think if we look back 20 years, I'm going to address both the issue of the social models that you just discussed, and how I characterize them and what has happened in the meantime. But I will also say a word about the EU budget, also because this is very much a topic for discussion among the heads of states who are meeting 200 or 300 meters from here. So, yes, you're right. we often talk in Europe about the European social model without an S, and contrast that to, in particular, the US social model. And I think it's true that if you look from Washington or if you look from outside of Europe, there is no doubt that there is a European social model which implies both the prosperity and the shared, sort of the equity and the efficiency. Not done differently in different countries, but I think that element is there everywhere, right? So there's no European country that doesn't claim to to want to have the element of shared prosperity or the element of equity. Now, once you look from within Europe, then you see there are indeed huge differences across the member states. Now, when I did that study, it was just before the EU enlargement, so I was not looking at the new member states, so those that joined the EU starting in 2004 from Central and Eastern Europe. I was looking at the Western European countries, the 15 countries at the time. And yes, I did see that when you are using those two criteria, and I defined them in a particular manner that I don't have the time to go over, but that related indeed to the efficiency and to the equity of those social models, I did observe that the EU member states bunched together into four groups. And one being indeed the Nordic group, including Denmark, Finland, and Sweden, but also actually Netherlands and Austria. And those countries that had high efficiency and high equity. And then there was another group of countries that was exactly the opposite, low efficiency and low equity, again, compared to the European average, not to the global average, to the European average. And those were the Mediterranean countries. It was Italy, Spain, and Greece. And then there were two other groups of countries, the continentals, or country here, Belgium, Luxembourg, France, Germany. Those were countries where there was high equity, but at the expense of efficiency. And then there was another group where there was high efficiency, but lower equity, and those were the Anglo-Saxon. I would call them today actually the Atlantic countries. It was the UK, it was Ireland, and it was Portugal, indeed the Atlantic country. So this notion of a trade-off between equity and efficiency that, one often thinks, from the US, you say, well, yes, you guys are very equitable in Europe compared to what you are, but at the expense of efficiency. We are a more efficient society, and you are more equitable, and there is a trade-off. Now, that worked between the continentals and the Anglo-Saxon, but they did not work with the Nordic. So the Nordic, they seem to have the secret formula that they were able to have both equity and efficiency. So did I advocate that for all countries? Not really, in the sense that, I was aware then and today that obviously those are the result of long historical, social, political processes. And you're not going to have a decree from Brussels to say France or Greece is going to adopt the marvelous, maybe was marvelous, Nordic model.
Some of it happened in the 2013.
That's right. No. So, no, what has happened in the last 20 years? So I looked at my classification of countries, and I sort of, and how did I measure essentially efficiency? It's in terms of employment rate. At those countries with high employment rate or low employment rate, and equity is measured with an indicator that we have in Europe, the risk of falling into poverty, okay, which you can get from Eurostat. Now, if you look at what has happened in the last 20 years, not much, in a sense, has happened on the equity. Countries that were equitable have remained, on the whole, equitable. Countries that were not very equitable have not improved. Some did, but in general, not much. So on that front, the equity part of the social models has not changed a lot. What has changed a lot is the efficiency. There's been increase in a sense of efficiency the way I measure it, which is the employment rate. The country that has been the highest change of employment rate was Germany, but almost all countries. Denmark didn't change on
either indicator. No change of equity, but it was already very high. And no change of efficiency, it was already very high. So it was already doing very well. It did not do better. What is interesting is that the countries that did increase efficiency, very few of them did at the expense, as one may have feared, at the expense of loss of equity. Yes, I know one often discuss Germany created a lot of job, a lot of bad job, right? This is but it doesn't show up in terms of the income distribution, in terms of the risk of poverty. It doesn't show up. So Germany is the country that increased the most the efficiency, and you can see that France is trying a bit to emulate that. To have the increase, but it's not very easy. Now, there are a few countries, for instance, Sweden has increased a little bit on efficiency, a bit at the cost of equity. I think one element, and maybe it would be interesting to hear the commissioner on this, not on the EU, but on her home country, has been the situation with migrants. How our societies, I mean, in a sense, we have a great asset that we have inflow of younger population from migrants. So especially for us who have aging populations in Europe, and this is great. But then there's the question of how well we are able to make efficient use of the migrant population and how well our societies are organized to provide the opportunities for migrants to participate in a most desirable manner for the creation of the prosperity. I think that in some of the Nordic countries, and we have seen that in Sweden, where there's been major inflow of labor, and there's not been always the best ability, maybe because the inflow was so high to deal with that. Germany has done actually rather well. I'd be very curious to hear what has been the situation in Denmark, because in Denmark, as in some of the Nordic countries, there's been a backlash. There's been at least a political backlash about the inflow of labor. So me personally, when I look at Belgium, I do consider that the inflow of foreign labor, of migrants, is a great opportunity. But how well our social system is working to make
More
this
education.
inflow, and in particular the education. And you're right to bring me to that, and I will end to that. To me, the key in delivering this golden situation of both high efficiency and high equity is indeed the education system. I think it's a great mistake, which is often done by economists, but also by political scientists and politicians, not to see education as part of the social model. I think a successful social model is one where you have high quality education, and high quality education for all, obviously not only for a few numbers. It's true that, you know, when we do reform of education in Belgium, we have a problem. We often look at the Finnish model, and I think that's right. So again, sort of the Nordics, they do have this ability to have a broad evaluation of their social model, including education. But, and I conclude with that, I don't think that you can do that from Brussels. So Europe cannot do much about it. Maybe we can sort of do comparison. This kind of issue, I think would be useful. League tables, a bit what we do. PISA does that, you know, the OECD does that with education system for PISA. Maybe to do that with social models, maybe the Commission could do some of that, but that's about the extent, sort of providing data and helping countries to see what are the weaknesses of their system and what are the strengths.
So maybe before we take the first question from the audience, we would like the former Minister of Education of Denmark to give a opinion on this, since she's also here.
Yeah. No, first and foremost, at a European level, we do something. The Council just adopted 2 Council recommendations when it comes to digital skills, to make sure both that you have basic digital skills and also more advanced digital skills. pushing for that. And of course, we use data comparisons for people to see. And the second thing is that social matters now is integrated in the European semester in order to make sure that you have a much fuller picture than what you had before. And last but not least, I think one of the major changes happening in the years to come is the fact that now men have a right to parental leave, which is a huge progress that would never have happened without European legislation. Just as well, Denmark only got equal pay for equal work, I think back in 74 or something like that, because of European legislation. So European legislation can have massive impact also on the national market and on social affairs. And when it comes to education, I think it's really, really important to include that in the social setup. The thing is that you cannot finance high quality education if you do not have a good tax system. So things, of course, comes together. And there is, I think, a balancing act here because businesses, they are gaining from being able to draw from a highly educated workforce, which they also need to finance actually being enabled. So I think there is something for everyone here. The tricky thing when it comes to education is, of course, to make sure that young people find that it's relevant, that they fully engage, that the resources there are well spent. And I think every country in Europe has their own challenges in making their educational system work well. Denmark has their challenges, France has their, and so on and so forth, because we're in a time of upheaval. What is the good advice of what you should learn now? Well, I think a very fundamental advice is that you should learn how to learn, and that the school system should not, turn off your curiosity, your willingness to learn, your ability to learn, because it's a given that with the speed of development in the world that we're in, you need to go repeat. It's only a good day if you have learned something new.
And I have colleagues who moved to Denmark and told me that it was indeed a big difference with Belgium. Maybe we can start taking questions from the floor. Let's start with questions from within the room.
So just a question, I don't know if you can answer that. And it's related to what was just said about new technologies are introduced and they typically tend to hurt people at the bottom of the skill distribution. And at least in the US and in other countries, there are forces, globalization forces or anti-immigration, etc., that get intercepted politically by populist parties or, conservative parties. And if this is what is going, the future of Europe, one may be worried that this populist party are also anti-European parties. And so this is, an extra worry for the European project, for the social model. And we see, even in Scandinavian countries, inequality is going up. So it seems that those forces that have been, working out in the US are going to be working out in the same way in European countries. So just wondering if you guys had some thoughts on this.
One thing that strikes me about this kind of questions is that we typically analyze them from a national or even sometimes subnational perspective, when clearly it's happening everywhere. So it is also a global problem. I don't know which of you wants to answer first.
Well, maybe I can have a go first. Well, I think observing economic history, new technology has always provided new jobs, new kinds of jobs, even though some jobs, they disappeared. And very often they have also made jobs so much easier. Just imagine a construction industry without the machinery that they use these days. I think what we have ahead of us and what is changing, also maybe the perception, is that artificial intelligence will affect the work done by so many other professions than what we have seen so far. And that, of course, should enable a new discussion about what kind of society do we want? Because what we have done so far is that we have used technology to make humans' contact points disappear. I can have my parking permit, I can pay my parking fine, I can do that all online, I don't have to go anywhere. I can do my tax return online, I can get my overpaid taxes back online. I can do everything online. I do my banking online. I check out myself in the supermarket. So we have eradicated human contact points. Now, when we get artificial intelligence and we get many more robotics, then I think it's the time to say, well, we need to consider what kind of society do we want? Because we need contact points. When I was Minister of the Interior, we were pushing automated vacuum cleaners. We had a huge discussion about cleanliness, or if municipalities would actually help disabled people, old people who could not do the cleaning themselves, by someone coming to clean. People found that it was not useful, but did they want automated cleaning? Not in a million years. Because they would rather have that someone came than that their floor was clean. And I think it's really important to say, we will use technology everywhere, but we need to make sure that we use it in a way that it creates a society that lives up to the social model that we have. Because the social model that we just had introduced is still built on the trust of other people and the legitimacy of how our labor market works and how our social services work. And this is why a discussion about new technology with this very advanced level that we're in now cannot be successful without a discussion about what kind of society do we want? What kind of contact between people do we want to enable?
And Gabrielle, maybe something about how you tax the surplus coming from machines and automation.
Perhaps, but perhaps more importantly, and to Luigi's point, I don't think there's such a direct link between technology and then inequality and then electoral outcomes. I think one of the big lessons of all the work that's been done to create comparable series of inequality across countries and over time, one of the big lessons is that what's really key is domestic policies in the evolution of inequality, and that technology doesn't play such a big role. You know, the simplest way to see that is to compare the evolution of inequality since the 1980s in the US, let's say, where it has increased a lot, and in other parts of the world, in continental European countries, for instance, where it has increased much less. And these two economies have been subject to the very same forces of considerable technological change and international trade and globalization. And yet the dynamic of inequality has been really different. So what this shows is just that domestic policies play a critical role, you know, labor market regulation, minimum wage, competition policies, taxation, progressive taxation in particular, the regulation of healthcare or finance, what have you, all of that matters a great deal. The second thing I would say is that even though everybody seems to agree with the idea that, yeah, the way to fight inequality or the potentially unequalizing effects of technology is to invest in education. Everybody agrees with that. I think policymakers in France, for instance, have been doing that from right and left for a long time. But there is a huge gap between the discourse and then the practice. Even though we say, and have been saying for a long time, that the EU should be, the economy of innovation and everything, when you look then at the reality of public spending in higher education and research in the European Union, it is not going in the right direction. Take a country like France and you look at public spending on higher education per student enrolled in the higher education system, and it has actually collapsed over the last 15 years, between 2008 and 2023. At the same time as the very policymakers who decided that reduction in spending per student said it's so important to invest in universities, in higher education, and in research. I think it's very important that we arrive at more consistency between what we're saying, and I agree with that, about the critical role of public investment in education and the reality of our budget.
So I'm sure we are hitting right in the center of the Sapir report again from 20 years ago, which shows this foresight. But I would like to take more questions, otherwise we will not have time to finish the meeting. Go ahead.
So I hear all panelists highlight the sort of degrees of freedom that policymakers have. You know, there are international forces, but indeed there are things we can do, and there are different outcomes that correspond to that. So I can't resist a temptation, in keeping with the title of the panel, to ask you about this kind of, how do you see this clash somehow of when this climate imperative is meeting macroeconomics in particular, but also public micro, and you can see all kind of exciting new policy instruments. You know, you have federal job guarantees, and you have universal basic services, and you have adversarial interoperability for trust busting, and all these like new things, mission economies, you name them. And so the impression is economic policy is on the verge of a shift, of a transformation with more degrees of freedom, apparently, that are given to policymakers as we move from this kind of theoretical, there is no alternative, to theoretical, actually, there are quite some alternatives. And I would like to hear a like round of how do you perceive this, seen as you sit in the core of policymaking.
So Andre, you precisely mentioned that we could have huge improvements on efficiency without increasing inequity.
So I'm very glad that you're asking that you are raising the issue about climate, because I have a slightly different view than Gabriel about Europe and the member states, about the technology, and in particular about the globalization and linked to politics. So I think that there is a problem, a political problem, both on the climate and on globalization, for the allocation of tasks in Europe, where indeed we do the prosperity at the EU level, plus taxation. So there is a role, because single market, and we want to make sure that the single market does not result in a loss of taxes, and we need the revenue from taxes in order to be able to finance the social model. But I mean, you do see that across different, and when you look at voting, and you know, I've done a study on sort of populism, voting for populist party, you see that there are important differences between urban and rural, between higher educated and low educated, between older voters and younger voters. And there are some that are much more worried about globalization and about climate change. And we cannot dismiss it. You know, we are urban people and high educated, and I don't know whether we are young, but you know, many of us are young still. But you know, I mean, our view has to be also put against the views of the other ones, the ones that are voting for more populist parties. And yes, I do agree that the main policies that need to be undertaken in terms of the sharing part, the sharing of this equation of prosperity, is at the national level. So I agree with that. But I think that there is a responsibility also on the spending side, not just on the revenue side, the taxation, on the spending side at the EU level. I was one of those who advocated 20 years ago, and I was happy that it was implemented, even though it's a bit too small for my liking, this notion of this globalization fund. So there is money in Europe, a bit like in the US for the TA, the trade assistance program. There is money available. Okay, the EU project is itself dislocating some jobs. There's always job creation, but job creation, that's on net, but you have to look at the flow. And some people have a harder time to get a job than others, or they may even get a job that has a lower salary than before, or they have to move. Again, if you are urban, highly educated, and young, you know, you get a job very, very quickly. But what about the others? And those precisely are voting for the populist parties. I think you find the same thing exactly with climate today.
There is, and we have seen that in the Netherlands recently, we'll see what happens in the election next year. There is a backlash, not on the part of society, but certain segments of society about the rapidity, what some see as rapidity, others say, you know, we are doing the climate change much too slowly. You know, look at the objectives that we have for 2050. We have the Commission has put forward an ambitious objective for 2030. There's no way we are going to be there. We need to accelerate. Fine. Okay. I'm in favor of that. But some people in this society and other countries are not in favor of that. Okay. They said, hey, wait a second. You know, I need my car to go to my job. I already have, you know, I'm already working at one job, maybe two jobs without the car. And, you know, if you're going to increase the price of my car and you're going to squeeze me. I'm already at the margin and you're going to squeeze me. So I do think that, yes, we do have policy at the national level. I think the EU is well advised to also get involved in programs that are helping citizens, or at least perceived to be helping citizens, either by helping member states to be able to do the job. I mean, one can see, but I don't think that the EU, which is now so much associated with the Green Deal and climate, can simply then say, well, it's up to the member states to pick up the pieces where there are difficulties. So I think we need to find a balance there in order to make sure that, you know, we can implement those policies that are needed on climate.
So there is a recent paper by Marco Butti at Bruegel that also advocates for European level public goods. We have another question from the floor.
Thank you. Well, thanks a lot for this very interesting set of interventions. Going maybe a bit in the same direction about Europe needing to be seen as providing some public goods for everybody. It's of course true that I guess it's fair to say that when you compare Europe and the US, okay, I mean, you can talk about tax progressivity, which of course is insufficient on both sides, but especially in the US. You can also look at the size of the public budget. And there you see that Europe in total, the European countries are higher. But it is very striking that we just compare the federal budget in the US versus the EU budget here. It's completely the opposite. And so Europe is a regulatory giant. And I do agree with the idea that we should do even more on the single market, but we are doing already a lot. I think more than 50% of our rules come from Europe. But the budget, of course, is tiny, 1%. So the question is, if you want to do all these things, where will the money come from? By the way, when you ask, I understand, when you ask US citizens what they like about the federal government, they say, or at least that was 10 years ago, I don't know, they say Social Security, so pensions, and Medicare. And of course, there, Europe is not doing anything. Now, it's of course very touchy because we don't have the same models and all these kind of things. But I do think there are indeed funds to help with globalization is one idea. I also think, let's face it, the 1% of a budget to do serious green transition, to do serious defense activities. You know, we all love DARPA. DARPA, the D is for defense. Now, our EU defense industry, and especially army, are a bit pathetic. And currently, let's face it, if we don't do anything about this today, we will never do. And so I think that would be a way to go. I think, and also DARPA was helpful for big tech. And, you know, the IRA, of course, is dwarfing what we are doing in Europe on the green transition. And when you look at the market cap of Tesla relative to the EU car industry, you ask yourself, well, will Tesla do to the EU car industry what Apple did to Nokia? I don't know, but we need to maybe, and that may be politically easier to go through to the public investment route in order to really increase the visibility of Europe. Thank you.
So we are actually returning to the first comments Mr. Stager made at the beginning, that if we can't share taxation, if we can't have public funding of projects where we can pick the best projects at a European level. And my question there is quite similar. And so since we're coming to a close, let me go back to that kind of questions. Shouldn't we centralize some of these projects? So stop playing at the local levels? As you said, states raise barriers all the time. So shouldn't we just give up these barriers by centralizing more of the budget, the project budgets, the research in medicine, etc., at the EU level? With the funds, of course.
But I think that would be relevant in a world without culture and without national identity and without history.
But isn't that a contradiction with what you were saying at the beginning?
No, not at all. My point is just to say that once we have agreed something, and actually we have very strong agreement on the single market, we also need to not only to implement, but we need to enforce. And enforcement is an everyday practice. That doesn't mean that member states should do nothing. But for instance, one of the things we have very, very simple directive from the last mandate to strengthen competition authorities, to make sure that they have sufficient resource, sufficient independence, and sufficient tools. How many member states had implemented or transposed that directive at the deadline? A handful. A handful. It's a very simple thing. To get to a situation where we can actually tick the box to say we have now one set of rules instead of 27 set of rules, very often we'll have a patchy picture of one set of rules complemented with 27, some partly disabled, some still in effect, all of that. So we have quite a lot to do within the existing framework. And I think it will be very daring to believe that we can get the necessary political support, let alone ratification in a number of countries for a new treaty that is more centralized, when we are not even making sure that the competences that we have already are sufficiently effective. Because I think we still have a way to go. And the second thing is that to make up, so to speak, for the pandemic, we took a loan, a gigantic loan, 800 billion euros. It is literally in the name of the next generation. They are going to pay it off. The point of that loan and the different envelopes to member states is that they are to be used for reforms and investment. Reforms to enable absorption, reforms to enable that the investments are actually effective. So it's really good for the individual countries and for Europe in total. The agreement was that member states should then figure out how to pay back that loan by enabling own resources to the Union. Not €1 has materialized to pay back that loan. Right now, one is discussing whether it's not for the European budget to find the increased funding needed to pay the interest of this loan. So to think that we can have more tax going directly to the European Union when we cannot even agree on paying back a loan, you know, first things first. Credibility as a lender comes from the ability to pay back the loan. Of course, in the very end, it will be for member states. So in that respect, we are credible, but we would be more credible if we actually had own resources to pay back the loans that we had.
So should we have a European tax on
So
corporations,
I
for
think
instance?
first things first, you know, Mario Monti has made the most beautiful report with numerous suggestions of own resources. One could get started to say, well, we're not just discussing it, we're actually doing it. And just maybe one remark on the RRA. The RRA works in very different ways than how European support is working. But if you look at how European member states and also part of the European budget has supported the green transition over the years, you'd find that we're not dwarfed. And I think that is really important because it is part of sort of how we express ourselves. And also, Europe is not losing out. if you compare the US and Europe with numbers that are corrected for purchase power, Europe is constant or slightly increasing compared to the US. We have numerous problems. My point is just to say that not all of them are as difficult as we would sometimes seem to think. But my suggestion would just be that we solve the most obvious problems first, and they are presenting themselves just in front of us. And as said initially, one of those is taxation. The Commission has placed two proposals in front of the member states in order to increase it, for instance, to implement in full the OECD arm's length principle in national legislation. That would be a much better concrete step than start discussing whether or not we should have direct taxation to the union.
So our debate is unfortunately already coming close to exactly. We could stay another hour or even another day, but let me bring a genie out of the bottle. This genie comes and grants you three wishes, right? So each of you can make one wish, which will get realized. Gabriel, what would be your wish? And what would you like to see realized?
Let's say global, it could start with the EU, minimum tax on billionaires. We should have own resources for the European Union, and progressive taxation is always done better at a more federal and coordinated level. And so it would make a lot of sense for the EU to say, look, we are going to tax the very wealthiest individuals. In the global tax evasion report, we propose to create a 2% minimum tax on global billionaires. We know it's possible to have such international agreements because we have a minimum tax on multinational companies, this 15% minimum tax that I discussed. Now the time has come to apply that logic of coordinated minimum taxation to the wealthiest individuals. And I very much hope that the EU will take a leading role in making that happen.
How much would that bring to the EU budget?
So for the world as a whole, it's about $250 billion. For the EU, we have all the numbers in the report. It's a bit less than 100 billion euros. So we're talking about very significant sums. And look, even though the debt, the COVID debt is 800 billion euros, as you reminded us, it's just 5% of the EU's GDP. It's not going to be very hard to reimburse that. If we tax the wealthy in the EU, we can easily get 1% of GDP in revenue each year. If we do a better job at taxing multinational companies, instead of 15%, let's have a 20% minimum tax rate. Instead of all the exemptions, let's get rid of the exemptions. We can get an extra point of GDP in tax revenue each year. So that's my wish.
Thank you. André.
Actually, I would also do something on taxation, but not the same at all. I would, because what I don't like about the wealth tax at the EU level is very hard to link wealth to the EU. So it seems to me that if I wanted to do a taxation at the EU level or some harmonization, obviously we are not going to endow the European Parliament with for quite a while with the power of taxation. So this is going to come in a different manner. The money will still come from the member states. We do have some taxation at the EU level, and that comes from an EU-wide activity. It's trade with the rest of the world, right? So the duties, the import duties, they go to the EU, and that's normal because we are a customs union, and that's sort of in a sense linked to the internal market. So I would look for resources also linked to mobility, company taxation of activities that are cross-border, that are again linked to the internal market. Because I agree with the Commission in the sense the core of the EU from an economic viewpoint certainly is the internal market. There would not be competition policy if there was not the internal market. There would not be the customs union if there was not the internal market. So the internal market is the core, and everything that relates to the internal market seems to me, is where we need to discuss. So internal market activities that are generating revenue taxation. I think this is where we need to get at, and I think it's company taxation.
Thank you. Mr. Stager, last but not least.
Yeah, I would like to put my genie wish in the pocket for another event, because I was very inspired by your sort of very active, what I'd say, positive realism, starting that what we're discussing here is all reflected in human choices, policy choices, things that we can go do differently. And I think the first thing that would create, I think, some encouragement in this would that the 15% taxation would indeed be effective. That income would actually be taxed, not be moved around, not be moved out. And if moved, it would still be the object of 15% effective taxation. This is absolutely doable. It's a question of the willingness of those who do corporate taxation, and it doesn't take neither a genie. It only takes, that we overcome previous political choices, and that would serve European citizens very, very well.
For that, maybe you need multiple genies. So I want to thank everyone, the three panelists, of course, to begin with, the audience for these wonderful and interesting questions. I would love to keep going, and I have myself 1,000 questions, but time is time. So I would like also to thank all the people who made the event possible in terms of organization, in particular, Paulina Chauchuk, Claire Gatti, Grégoire Seger, and Gaël Kubadivita at Solvay, Francis Vella, Mary Gordon, and Julia Murillo at Georgetown, and Nadine Clark at CEPR. Thank you very much.